I'm really looking forward to it. I think Jojo too. The topic itself, I think, is going to be huge. If I give a bit of context, the global climate change models, I think we now know they tell us where we need to get to. So the data we use in determining a destination for 2030 and 2050 are not universally agreed. There's still some outliers who question them, but broadly speaking, I think industry, government, society at large are saying this is what we need to do. The problem, as always, when you have a big challenge like that, is in the detail. So in 2030, if you go down a level, that means in the property industry, we need to start, we think, for example, 40% of new build need to have all embodied carbon removed. 9 years is nothing. So that's where we are now, that the decision-making that is sitting in front of us in multiple industries, whether it is energy or transportation or agriculture or property or water management or city leadership and city management, are now all facing this challenge to act within the net zero framework that we've developed. So we'll be talking about that today, but probably not so much in the abstract, or if there are questions at that level, we quite happily try to answer those too. I mean, we don't know, obviously, all the answers. We're just here to initiate and get us going. But we also then want to go a little bit into energy as a specific sector, which we felt was sort of quite important because energy is both an industry itself that obviously needs to make changes, and it's a key industry for all the other verticals that I mentioned, because that's where we are getting our energy from, so to say. If I just say a few words about Arup, and then Jojo will say a bit about her startup, and then we'll have a general chat and touch on some of the stuff we're doing with the ODI, and then that will lead us to the discussion with you guys. So Arup, we are a global company with about 17,000 people. We do at any point in time 16,000 projects, and they all have to become net zero projects. So that's quite exciting. As a firm of engineers, we like problem solving. That's like one of the biggest problems we've ever faced, or actually the biggest opportunities we've ever faced, because we're no longer going into our clients and saying, well, you could be doing this, what about that? They are now coming and saying, how do you assure that my asset portfolio or my, we're doing a lot of work in renewable energy right now, meets these targets. So this is no longer a nice to have for a company like Arup. This is now a core activity because both our clients, our employees, and our partners are demanding to deal with climate change in a strategic way. Data for us will be not the answer. So we're not going to save the world just by having data, but it will be a critical ingredient to create actionable insights and to know how to design or what to design or how to operate the assets that we work with. And that's why we joined the ODI, because we think today data is not really addressed at that scale. It's quite task-orientated. It sits in small software packages. It's not shared. It's not open when it should be open. It's not closed when it should be closed. So the data spectrum stuff the ODI has done with us has been really helpful. So that's where we are right now. We would like to have by 2030 all our projects fully operating within the Paris Accord. And for that, we need partners and want to have discussions like this. Jojo, what about your startup? You're sort of at a slightly different scale, but facing similar questions.
Very similar problems. So, and can everyone hear me? So we kick off on the data side. Actually, to pick up on kind of Volker's definition of data, data is for making better decisions. And then we pick that up on the kind of digitalization side. So, okay, so now you've got information about how you're using renewables, how you're using network capacity. And Electron basically creates software that lets network utilities speak to people who are operating batteries, electric cars, and what have you, and telling them kind of where and when and how they want them to consume or export. So we got really involved. I mean, we're 5 years old now, so we're kind of, a toddler more than a startup. And when we got really involved in this space, we were missing all of the data as infrastructure to start building some of these markets. So kind of personally and as a company, we got really involved in the kind of government's energy data journey. As an individual, I also sit on the UK regulators challenge group for data and network regulation, everything around that. And what's interesting is the data policy then has really gone to the heart of what are we trying to do for net zeros. So, and again, when Volker said, we're focusing on energy, that's a real, that's like the most important area to start first, because if we're trying to get to net zero by 2035 for energy, until you decarbonize your energy systems, what's the point in decarbonizing transport or heat or anything like that if you're just going to go and like turn gas into electricity and then kind of go again? So we kind of jumped off on the kind of, data, yes, but data for what? Data for better decisions, data for kind of better process automation.
I think we're almost the same age, but not literally, but in terms of our work with data. When you said you're 5 years old as a startup, we started what I call our journey with sort of data and a capital D around the same time. So we've been around for 75 years, but our data was in spreadsheets we've got 6,000 applications in use at any point in time. So the data sits in those applications. To change that was almost the same time we started. Well, I think the built environment more generally started to say, we need to change how we work with data, and we need to make sort of decisions around data literacy, knowledge sharing. But in the end, it also needs to be paid for.
Such an important point.
So how do your funders and your customers sort of understand you? Are they saying like, yeah, we got it now, this is sort of data at scale, that's why we need a platform like you guys provide?
So our route through this was actually really, and it's so interesting now to say, with the benefit of hindsight, that 5 years ago is kind of when this journey kicked off. But our route through this industry was very similar. We started off by being like, I came from the asset investment side. So, we've been very used to building huge renewable projects and batteries and what have you. And, you need information to decide how you want to deploy capital. Then we were kind of thinking of this more kind of temporally, relevant information to deploy assets. And we were thinking, well, everyone needs that. There's going to be millions of different markets and price signals. We're going to build this kind of shared data hub. We started using distributed ledger technology. So it's this idea that like there's all these different data monopolies, unconnected data sets. Let's connect them and just write all the governance and access rules. And that's the useful thing to build. But the problem was then, we got some big sponsors. We got the government, we got National Grid, we got 2 of the network utilities to kind of put money behind that system. We kind of developed a prototype. We're like, here you are, here's a shared coordinated data set. And everyone's like, for what? Like, you can go and build energy markets now. And they're like, oh, can you help us go and build markets on top of that? So that the whole value chain of data is missing. So we've kind of handed over to organizations like your own and gone, okay, well, bigger people than us are going to work out how to share this data. And we've moved one step closer in the value chain and said, okay, because some of this data is beginning to exist and we can extract some of this data, then we can create these kind of marketplaces as a service for you.
But that's where we are desperate to have more marketplaces emerging. We found in energy, the industry doesn't yet know how to organize the marketplaces. So we did a report again with the ODI that bilateral data sharing, we want to move to APIs and high volume, so high velocity automated data sharing. But in energy, we found around 6,000 organizations that we transact with. That are sort of stakeholders in the ecosystem. We can't just agree through bilateral agreements with everybody how we share data. And even if we do, there are obviously then different agreements that happen between the 5,999 others who build their relationships. So we need data pooling, we need platforms emerging, we need data trusts emerging, but we also need this sort of decentralized idea that open banking implemented, we think. But do you see government and industry speaking that language now, or are we sort of in the early stages of this becoming an understood sort of domain and profession working with data in this way?
I think we're still in the really early stages. The big change kind of now versus maybe 3 years ago is the headline, energy data is key for net zero. But we're still thinking of energy data as this like kind of amorphous beast Whereas, when you're on the front lines trying to kind of create use cases and business cases to go and get this data, clean this data, use this data, you realize actually it's the kind of value-added services that sit on top of it. And I think we've been really hurt by this idea that like data is the new oil that you kind of read over and over again in Economist kind of 5 years ago, because it's not oil. Like, we have to think of data in energy. Data is like infrastructure. We were having this kind of conversation earlier, like, without the infrastructure of data, you can't go and do digitalization. And so you have this kind of idea of this shared commodity and this idea of these shared use cases. But without these individual kind of companies or services going and creating value from that data, then all of the individual use cases are just purely academic, and it's impossible to get 6,000 different companies to agree what should be done first.
I mean, data as the new oil was terrible, wasn't it? I mean, don't quote me on what any of you came up with that phrase. I apologize openly, but it's just not. It's not like that at all. We tried data as gold. That was terrible too. And we're sort of now a little bit looking at it like our own people. You need to look after it. You need to nurture it. Some of it you want to share. You want to develop it. But when we then work with it and try to do that, in our early prototyping, 60% of the cost went into ingestion, transformation, cleansing, the stuff that you guys do. And we just got really fed up with that, because that's not where a company like Arup adds value. We don't want our engineers spend hours looking at ingestion and transformation cleansing. We want to have access to clean APIs. We want to have data that is actually applicable to the challenges we face with our clients. So this is sort of then the beginning, isn't it, of a new era. And I think energy probably will be in the UK one of the verticals that moves faster, because the government has started now, hasn't it, with its open energy program. Yeah. Sort of language is emerging. Companies like you can say, actually, we fit into here. And in Arup, we can come and say, well, we are fitting in this part of the data value chain, and we started to connect these dots together. Are you so equally excited about the open energy movement that is happening right now and where we are on that journey?
I mean, I'm really excited. I think I'm really disillusioned as well. And I will spend all of my time trying to move along that disillusion. And it's one of the reasons it's such a joy to be here. But I think, I mean, the first sets of data you've got to get right are static data, aren't they? It's stuff like, where is this thing? Like, what is this thing? Like, for example, in my world, we don't even know where all of the distributed energy assets are connected to the grid. Below 1 megawatt, like, forget about it. And until you know that, how are you making better decisions about where to reinforce networks, where to build more renewables and everything like that? And then I think the kind of second stage, and the second stage gets me really excited, is this idea of these living, breathing data sets. These, like, you've put data out there and people are doing things with it, like markets, for example, and sending back information about this is how people are trading in the back of it. This is like how customers are changing their behavior on the back of having that price signal to charge your car now or later. And I think we're still in the very foothills of that second world. And it's that second world that gets me excited, because optimization is a kind of two-way data flow game. It's like, we think this, what about this, what about this? So better decisions, great, but that's boring and hard, and there's a huge amount of standards. Data for optimization, that's when you get this kind of innovation boom, and you get like the internet of energy and all the things energy as a service and all these other exciting
things. I think
things.
that's really interesting. I think that's why our clients, again, are starting to see more interest, like in offshore wind farming. We would just find locations for these wind farms and then put them in there, and they would spend 25 years sitting in what we thought was the optimum location. At the end of 25 years, people go and say, so what do we do with the asset now?
Yeah.
Do we refinance it? What's our insurance on it? And then we found, actually, we have to send divers down or do visual inspections. So nowadays, you have sensing and instrumentation in the foundations. You measure the vibration of the turbines all the time. And as Arup, as an engineering company, we thought this was about the structural integrity and the value of the asset. Then we started to work with energy companies like yourselves, and they said, actually, the vibration and the production value of that wind farm, the data is linked. So now we are connecting output on how much energy an offshore wind farm can produce to its life cycle and the risk associated with maintaining that asset base. That were discussions 3 years ago we would not have had with any of our clients. And most of all, none of the investors that are sitting behind our clients would have wanted to know what this data is and how to use it. Now, what do you think is one of the challenges we still have in front of us to solve?
My personal hunch is you've got to start with the use case, with the kind of like the area in which data could create value today, and you've got to be able to expose that value to a whole bunch of parties who can then go after it and be like, okay, there's an inefficiency there that I'm going to be able to monetize. And if I'm going to be able to monetize it, you've got this kind of thousand eyes version of kind of problem solving where like lots of different people are competing to add more value. Whereas I think the way that I'm seeing a lot of this kind of open data process kicked off is much more starting at the very, very top with the kind of regulated monopolies and utilities and what have you, and not necessarily exposing like, here's the opportunity cost.
But the value, the use case, requires people who don't necessarily have the technical expertise to judge what it actually takes to expose that data or to work with that data. And I think that's where sort of the data literacy work is interesting. And we ran in Arup a data literacy program now for 2 years. We reached about, 2,500 people with the training program. But are we reaching the right people? Are the decision makers in the business who in the end sort of own the use cases, or whether it is an investable idea, do they understand why they need the data and what the value is to the decisions they are making? And if they do they know the complexity to get it out? And
it's such an important point, because then there's the whole cultural, like transformative piece around this different way of working with data, owning data, sharing with data, and collaboration, dare I say it, because no single company or data format is going to be correct for this space. Like energy data is such a big, it's like one of the broadest churches. And even in our world, we were talking earlier about things like smart meters, and you're always told by kind of government, oh, smart meters, there you are, we're going to give it to you, and they're going to go and get 30-minute resolution on every meter, and then you can go and get this type of data. But it's not the type of data you need to optimize like a network, or when should you be dispatching renewables or not. It's not high enough resolution. Like you can't go and access it from this kind of single central point, and because it hasn't started with this use case in mind, we're just going to create this really, really big,
it's a bit like
single data pool.
One of my data scientists said that to me. He said it's a little bit like the built environment has so far avoided the internet and has sort of expanded itself around bigger spreadsheets, and then Microsoft came out with sort of unlimited cells and rows, and that was like a big moment. But that's not really how we want to organize data in an ecosystem like the energy market. And I think that's where the journey is now, that we are seeing early use cases, but not yet universal change. And imagine then in a business like Arup, where you have our property clients, they need clean energy. They want to know where it's coming from, but they also need to know how their buildings are producing operational carbon. So how do we measure that? So these are all early days questions.
And just to pick up on that, one of the interesting things about this kind of cultural data journey on kind of thinking about centralized data versus kind of optimized data is it almost exactly mirrors the kind of physical change that's going on in our kind of energy grids, right? You used to build enough megawatt capacity to service all the peaks. And then if you have a shortage, like, in this energy crisis now, then you go, oh my God, and you go and build more big 40-year assets. Whereas like renewables completely change the game, because the megawatts aren't the valuable things. It's like when and where these megawatts are being, or megawatt hours are being produced. Because sometimes we've got a massive excess of megawatt hours in Scotland, and we paid £500,000 last year to turn it off. So like that's not the valuable thing, that particular unit of production. The valuable thing is optimizing where and when and how things are produced, and you see that cultural movement away from just building these kind of big centralized things and pools of data that are enough, to building something capable of kind of optimization and communication. It's still that same mindset change in the physical and the digital world.
So I think that is fascinating, that what you said about culture. When we started off with data strategy, we looked at our data infrastructure and science programs. We thought we had to hire more data engineers, more data scientists, give them some whizzy technology, and it's all going to be great. And then we realized, actually, we need an innovation program. We need to think about the new business models. We need to think about change. And then as soon as you start to think about change, we ended up again with knowledge, culture, and practices. We always keep coming back to that point that sort of culture eats strategy. And you can have the best plans in the world if your company or your industry isn't aligned in terms of why you want to do something. You're not going to make big change happen because there are too many micro barriers, sort of things stopping you every day, where you need not a contract, but you need sort of a cultural alignment. So if I come back to the beginning, or we started of saying 2030 is only 9 years away, that probably means in energy 2-3 years from now, we need to have figured out sharing, we need to have figured out what data institutions we need. We will have companies like yourself and their sort of third funding round being the next big thing. Companies like us will be smiling and thinking our data infrastructure cost is reduced. We no longer spend 60% on ingestion and transformation. Is that sort of realistic? Because open banking did it. Open banking spent, 3 years from the idea being discussed to having the first sort of large-scale sharing and implementation entities in place.
And it created all these new challenger banks and all this new consumer value.
Latest report said a 43 billion global market of open banking right now. Do you think in 3 years' time we'll be sitting here at another Canalside Chat with our friends from the ODI and saying, God, that was easy?
So this is the kind of source of my disillusion here. I think all of the big programs now, certainly that I'm involved in now, are still thinking about the kind of top-down structures and not necessarily where the new valuable businesses are going to be created. And open banking was super successful because there was a whole bunch of like startups who could go and create a better banking experience if they could just have these sets of these pieces of information that about someone's account, for example, or about an individual customer. I don't know if we're clear enough yet in energy about whether we are going to this bottom-up kind of transformational system, in which case, have at it, like we can all go and create this value, or whether we're still going for this kind of top-down infrastructure-led thing. And just to be like really geeky, we're all kind of reading the news at the moment and these kind of gas crises, and is it a shortage of gas or is it a shortage of delivery drivers, and people are conflating gas with their local petrol station being shut. And I'm sometimes worried that the government kind of goes, we believe in markets and we believe in optimization and these kind of thousand eyes problem. And as soon as there's like some crisis, they just go, no, let us bring it all back in, let us sort it, and we'll kind of
but maybe that's
tell you how to do.
Maybe that is the big cultural change we're facing, that the big utilities are centrally organized to a degree, or they are not monolithic, but they are organized by a small number of dominant players, because in the past, generation was an expensive business. Distribution was an expensive business. But now, when it comes to data, I think I agree, we're a mid-sized company, but we would like to be in a decentralized world where people can autonomously work and innovate, but it's connected. So somebody needs to organize the sort of connectivity between organizations.
Yeah, and that's it.
That's why we think the open banking model with its implementation entity is such a powerful idea also for the built environment.
And that's everything. It's the decentralized connected data sets that mean that, in 3 years' time, we could be here talking about how exciting it is that all this private capital has gone into creating all these new business models and opportunities, but we're definitely not there culturally yet.
So that's where all of you need to help. I think that all of us actually is probably the discussion in a sense. I don't know where you're from in terms of your organizations, but I had this discussion yesterday. So on Friday, not yesterday. Yesterday I was in a city celebrating with my kids, which was much nicer. But on Friday with a colleague, that we can try to be as clever as we want to be. We will not solve this as Arup on our own. Yeah. That's why we joined the ODI when it was founded. That's why we are working very closely now with Icebreaker One on the decentralization idea. Because these questions are too big for one organization. What we'd like to find are places where people can seek an agreement so you can actually work in a more efficient, decentralized way. I explain it sometimes with maps. If you go to Google Maps or if you go to Bing, and I won't quote here uptake and usage, just don't come to me, just entertain me. A bus stop is a bus stop on that. We know what that looks like. Or if you now in banking share your data because you want a mortgage quote with somebody else, it just works. And I think that's what we need to get to in energy, that our ability to collaborate and share with others needs to be transformed before we can make this big leap.
And what's interesting then is as soon as you decentralize that data sharing, and again, this is where we started as a company, it all becomes about governance. So what are the rules around that data, who gets to grant, rescind, access, and the access rights and everything. And so we kind of started with distributed ledger technology, that's the right answer, and our customers were like, it's not solving the right issue for us. The issue we're trying to solve is how do you implement this market? But I do think it all comes back to these kind of governance pieces. But again, we can't just solve the governance
and
without the use cases. And we're in this chicken and egg
Nobody wants to start
situation.
with governance.
No one wants to start with governance.
Governance is boring, I always say. People want to have impact, they want to have outcomes, but governance has to be part of it in a way.
Yeah.
I think that's, and also government, this is new to government. So the role in the regulated industries of government to facilitate the market is different when it comes to data sharing compared to facilitating introduction of renewable energy or microgrids. So these are really quite new topics, I think, for us as industries, for startups, for government, and the people who use the data. Now, the piece that we talked around sharing, decentralized, or having platforms like your platform, or the emergence of data trusts that are probably, in our view, they're a version of platforms, but potentially pursuing social good, or they pool data that has not the same commercial value that a company like yours can work with. We start to see that slowly happening. The literacy piece, the education piece is again slowly starting to happen. Where do you see, though, the use cases that you talked about earlier coming from right now? What's the most tangible example that Jojo and her team has sort of delivered and built something around?
So a really nice example of this is a marketplace that we took live in March last year in the Orkney Islands in Scotland. There's a whole bunch of renewable energy being turned off because there wasn't enough space in the local grid to export it. And we're like, well, that's a waste, and we can go after that waste. And there's also a network management system in place turning off these wind farms on the back of the grid being too congested for them to export. So we were able to go to EDF, to OVO Energy, to a company called Solo Energy, and say, you're controlling electric water heaters, batteries, electric vehicles in this region. If we could expose that energy access to you, and you could expose the location of those assets that could absorb it, then essentially we could create a market here where you're actually paid a portion of the earnings the wind farm would lose to use that energy. So you're paid to use energy, and it's win-win, and then we get kind of lower cost, lower carbon energy. And that was such a nice example because it was on an island, it was isolated, there was already a network control system, the kind of physical technology making sure that we can kind of breach this limit. So we had these three different kind of data sources already that we could start, and then we had this clear value gap. And that was really exciting, and that was a lot of, well, first, it was the first distributed energy market. It was the first asset-to-asset market that's actually moving how power flows in the grid. But we also found all this friction to do with scaling. The market data platform wasn't able to then go and feed that information back into the network utility to change set points, for example, because that was a completely different form of data, and it wasn't data they were allowed to share, and we hit these new GDPR rules, and the misalignment of incentives for this network utility to share data to create a market and find some new value versus not to share the wrong sets of data and breach GDPR or some contractual kind of licensing agreement.
Just because you guys are going to be asked in a minute, so think about your questions or just comment on how great the discussion was. That is also fine. But how much was climate data, because that's sort of what we came together, feature in those discussions? How much is that now baked into when people talk about these topics, to say we need to do this because it's commercially right, but it's also sustainably urgent and necessary to have this.
And funnily enough, not at all. You know, like it was like there was this really isolated value gap. We're kind of taking it across other areas in Scotland now, but like here is a bit of value that's being missed by the market. And, you know, it was obviously like the right thing to do for the climate and everything, but we didn't have those numbers to understand what it scaled up across. We just had one pot of value that we could go after today, and then we had all this technical capability that meant we could go after it. And it was nothing to do with the kind of bigger picture and everything to do with here's a bit of a missing market that we can go and
that probably is a
value in.
reality we're in right now, and that will maybe open up the questions to you and broaden it a little bit again, that we have got our global climate models, but that's not where the actions will be to actually on the ground change our embodied carbon, our operational carbon, our thinking on resilience, the future of non-financial reporting. That will happen within our industries that we work in, or within the consumer space on how they behave in that. And I think that's the gap we now want to close. So on the ground, do the right things in energy and property, but then also add up the numbers, if that makes sense, to meet our climate targets, because without that, we're all in big trouble. So if I look at one target we're reviewing right now is our property industry, where energy is obviously a big factor in how real estate portfolios perform from a climate change point of view. We don't have that right now. There isn't a market where we can go to and say, this is our validated data, and one asset management firm can compare with another asset management firm what has gone into these calculations. I think it's one of the problems of the data value chains, that everybody is making up their own numbers to a degree right now. That will have to change.
I would totally second that. There's so many use cases that you can't do today because that assurance doesn't exist. But there are use cases that you can do where you don't need that same level of assurance, where you can, again, consolidate better and better data by dint of starting to do it. And one area that people have been really upset about recently is this idea of greenwashing. So, you know, you pay a surplus for green energy, but are you actually getting green energy, and where's that going? And that's an area which you need assurance, but you don't have assurance. So what we can do is different companies are innovating and saying, I'm giving you insurance this way, and I'm giving you assurance this way. And the customers are following those things that they think are better forms of assurance. And it's beginning to set standards. But it really comes back to, like, maybe this is quite a kind of liberal view, but like setting standards through picking the right use cases and letting kind of customers and then private capital flock in behind the right propositions, I think.
But this is where the principles around the data value chain is not really discussed or understood necessarily by those who are, if it's a regulated market, regulating the market, or if it's a private industry, if I call it that, the industry players themselves haven't yet agreed that. If you look at financial services, that happened early on. You know, when we went into online trading, sort of when I moved to the UK, the early work I did here, there was a lot of work happening around the reliability of data between organizations and how they looked at the origination of data and the quality assurance of that. I think in the built environment, in energy and water and real estate, in cities, this is early days. Transportation is early days too. So yes, unfortunately, not an easy answer to say yes, it's all there. So we did two things. We did a lot of experimentation and prototyping, because the topic of sort of big data, we didn't like the word big data, so we called it data at scale. The idea of data at scale is really difficult to comprehend if that's not your professional background. So we did in transportation, in energy, in actually with a building. We just played with big data, and then we took different parts of our company into these experiments to see that. And I mean, not just the engineers, our board would come and visit a project and look at how they work with data and what's different. So that was one step for people to experience data at scale in an accessible way. And then we ran a training program that was based on the the hexagon shapes the ODI model has got. They've got a data literacy program with all these little red and blue hexagons. Anyway, that's a really nice framework. So we used that and developed 2 courses. One was called Introduction to Data. That's just 20 minutes of an online training module for any of our members. So any staff, whether you're the chairman or a graduate starting, or whether you're in HR, it's designed to give them sort of some language and some entry point into working with data. We then have a next module, it's called Working with Data, which is sort of more detailed, and you don't need to be an expert, but you need to be a bit more, slightly higher degree of proficiency. And now we're running a range of ML AI, sort of master's level training across the company. We're looking at creating data fellowships, which we hope will not just address technical staff, but also business leaders. So, if I take energy, we have a global head of our energy business. I would like that person to be as literate as Jodo is around the role of data in the energy sector. It will take probably 3 to 5 years to get the whole company to retool and reskill, and that's what we set out as our target. That sort of in 3 to 5 years we will have changed the sort of literacy level across the whole company.
Which is incredible. One of the things we were talking about before we came in, though, is how quickly COVID changed everyone's attitude to data and how fascinating statistics were. And everyone got quite used to looking at graphs and what have you. And some of the insights that were coming from that data taught people a lot about then what data was interesting to collect and share and what have you. And
I think it's spot on. I know I got in trouble for that from my comms and HR people, because I'm not allowed to talk on stage about football. I'm such a big football fan. I play five-a-side football, and the week before lockdown, I drew graphs on a napkin in a pub about doubling rate and growth and the statistics behind what had happened in Italy and where we were at that point in time. I said, this is going to happen here. And people were just interested. And you could see it was obviously a terrible reason why, but it became so tangible and so real to the individual to understand the value and the role data plays in understanding the future. And I think that is something that we've all been through now and probably will stay with us. I can't see people going back to believing graphs or not wanting to know where the source comes from or this sort of small-scale models as right.
But there's going to be space for a whole bunch of new influencers in energy who find the right way to plot, here's where we are on transformation and climate change, and here's what you can do and what have you. So the government in this country has been fantastic at supporting early stage innovation on this. So they've spawned a whole bunch of companies who have been able to get their first start and create their first kind of value-added service. But for that company to then go and grow independently and create better consumer or business propositions, you still need private financing. And this is something that kind of, we found kind of, year 3, we won every award and we go and build all these things. But like, you can't get to the next stage of growth or proposition until someone's like, okay, I can see that value that you're capturing for that person. And I can see that there are 3,000 other people like that, and you're going to go up. So there has to be a real business case within a couple of years of that first innovation. And I think that's what's really missing in our space. We speak to, 200 new PE firms every year who've raised money to go and invest in these scale-ups. And they're like, why is no one scaling up? There's no one kind of feeding this pipeline. So I think unless there's real business value, government funding won't bridge that gap, and we still can't see that.
I think government for us is more. We need government, certainly in energy, certainly in the regulated markets, to help organize and bring the market together and set certain standards, like we had with open banking. That is an industry-led or an industry-driven initiative, but you needed the Treasury and you needed government part of it, because otherwise it would not have come together. And I think we're the same in energy and water and most of these industries. But for a company like us, the main driver actually comes from our clients and our members. So we are struggling, or we will struggle to hire staff if we cannot provide them the environment and the tools that are just modern. So when we bring in currently energy professionals and we give them CSV files to work with, they smile, but they won't stay for long. Yeah? So the real driver for us is the clients asking for it, and the people that work for us, or our members, they also want it. And that usually then as a company, you have to go there. There isn't really a choice.